Welcome to my channel, Legal Jargon. I've devoted my channel for explaining law-related concepts and other current affairs updates relevant for cracking judicial services exams and other competitive exams. I've also started explaining the synopsis of important articles published in the editorials of the Indian Express and the Hindu. Today's editorial synopsis will have a special focus on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Please like and subscribe my channel for further updates, and don't forget to hit on the notification bell. In this session, I would be discussing 4 important articles published in the editorials and the explained sections of the Hindu and the Indian Express related to the Israel-Palestine conflict. The first article that I would be discussing is why Jerusalem's Al-AqsaMosque Mosque is an Arab-Israeli fuse, written by Rick Gladstone in the May 18th Express Explained Global section of the Indian Express. In this, the author covers the importance of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in 3 major religions and why is it a flashpoint now. As we know, recent violent clashes took place between Israelis and Palestinians at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. It shows the significance of the religious territory of Jerusalem. What is the Al-Aqsa Mosque? It sits inside a 35-acre site known by Muslims as the Haram al-Sharif or Noble Sanctuary, and the Jews call it Temple Mount. It is sacred to the Christians, Jews, and Muslims. According to Islamic scriptures, Aqsa translates as an account of Prophet Muhammad traveling from Mecca to the mosque in one night to pray and ascend into heaven. The mosque can hold 5,000 worshippers and is believed to be completed in the 8th century, facing the Dome of the Rock, the Golden Dome Islam Shrine, a symbol recognized as a symbol of Jerusalem. For Jews, it is called the Temple Mount, and it's known in Hebrew as Har Habayit, which is the holiest place because of its 2 ancient temples. The first one built by King Solomon and later destroyed by the Babylonians, according to the Bible, and the second temple, which stood aground for 600 years before it was destroyed by the Roman Empire. Even according to the UNESCO, Old City of Jerusalem has been classified as a World Heritage Site and of outstanding international importance. Now, who has control over the mosque? Israel captured East Jerusalem, including the Old City, from Jordan during the Arab-Israeli War of 1967 and annexed the area. Israel declared Jerusalem to be the capital, although it was not internationally recognized. Later, Israel entered into a status quo arrangement in the form of Israel's 1994 peace treaty with Jordan, where an Islamic trust known as the Waqf, controlled by Jordan, administered the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. Israeli security forces from then on coordinated with the Waqf. According to the status quo arrangement, Jews and Christians are allowed to visit the mosque, but unlike the Muslims, are prohibited from prayer on grounds under the status quo arrangement. Recently, Israel celebrated its annual celebrations of Jerusalem Day in the month of May. This caused many Palestinians to enter into a conflict. It was a provocation for many Palestinians who are residents of the eastern part of Jerusalem. Does Israel want to take full control of the site? Israel officials and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu do not intend to change the status quo. In April, however, Jordan's foreign minister formally complained about a large number of Jewish visitors violating the status quo and entering into the mosque. What is different about the latest protests? The author says that before the recent outbreak of violence at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, tensions were already building between the Jews and the Palestinians on issues not related to the mosque. Firstly, the Palestinians attacked Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem when they were carrying out a march chanting "Death to Arabs." And also, the Palestinians argued that the police had forbidden them from gathering at their favorite plaza in the Old City during the first weeks of their of the holy month of Ramadan. The protests further aggravated when Palestinians fought with the Israeli police over their forced eviction from Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood to make way for Israeli settlements. This Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood of Palestinian settlers in East Jerusalem. After the clashes, President Mahmoud Abbas had to also postpone the legislative elections. How many previous clashes have shaped the Israeli-Palestine conflict? The author says that confrontation of religious shrines in Jerusalem has an important reason for shaping of Israeli policy. For example, in the 1990, deadly riots exploded after a group of Jewish extremists went on to lay a cornerstone of a temple to replace two destroyed temples. US condemned Israel for the violence. In 2000, there was a visit to the site by Jewish settlers and under the leadership of the right-wing Israeli politician Ariel Sharon. This was a catalyst for Palestinian uprising known as the Second Intifada. In 2017, 3 Arab Israeli citizens shot and killed 2 Israeli Druze police officers. This led to Israeli authorities ramping up security at the site, which angered the Arabs. And violence kept building at the mosque. And hence US diplomatic intervention was required. The next article that I would be discussing is Israel-Hamas ceasefire, written by Stanley Johnny, published in the Explained section of The Hindu on May 21st. The author basically gives us an account of the 11-day airstrikes and the rocket attacks on Gaza between Israeli forces and Hamas, which later on led to an Egyptian-mediated ceasefire this month. Both sides have agreed to hold the ceasefire based on certain ground circumstances. The author also compares the 2014 clashes between Israeli forces and Hamas and the 2021 clashes between Israel and Hamas. On May 10, 2021, Israel military campaign had begun, where Israel carried out more than 1,800 strikes on Gaza, leaving maximum damage to infrastructure and causing many civilian casualties, according to UN-based sources. It led to a disproportionate civilian casualties and caused international pressure being mounted. Israel took the defense of the victim of terror, but it did not sustain as it continued occupation of Palestinian territories in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, international laws and norms. There were too many civilian casualties in Gaza this time, such that even Israel's right to defense supporters agreed for a ceasefire. The international pressure was mounted twofold, where the UN Security Council called for a ceasefire and the Biden administration issued a statement regarding de-escalation of Israeli forces. The internal pressure as well as external pressure or global pressure felt by Israel caused the Israeli Security Cabinet to accept a unilateral and mutual ceasefire with Hamas. Did Israel achieve its goals? According to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, there are two ways of dealing with the conflict, either by conquering Hamas or establishing deterrence. The Prime Minister's aim is a forceful deterrence, but is open to the possibility of conquering. According to the Gaza Health Ministry information, 232 Gazans and 66 children were killed in Israeli strikes. This damage was more than what was caused to Israeli side, where only 12 people, 1 child and 3 foreign nationals were killed. There is no proof of actual deterrence here, as Hamas continued to shell out almost 300 rockets into Israel till the very last moment. The strategy of Hamas is... What is the strategy of Hamas? Palestinians celebrated the resistance when the ceasefire was announced and called it a euphoria of victory. On May 10th, Israeli forces stormed Al-Aqsa Mosque in East Jerusalem. Hamas made a political point by showing that it's a real defender of Jerusalem by launching rockets into Israel. Israel retaliated and relaunched rockets on Gaza. Hamas demonstrated its growing rocket fire capabilities this time by launching at least 4,000 rockets in 11 days, which are more than the rockets it launched in the 50 days conflict in 2014. Likewise, there were more casualties than in 2014. What's next? In 2014, after the ceasefire was announced, Israel attempted to assassinate Hamas' shadowy military commander, Mohammad Deif, but failed. In 2021, Hamas has accepted the terms of the ceasefire on the condition that Israel promises to lift their attention from Sheikh Jarrah, where Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem are being forcibly evicted by Israeli forces. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is another flashpoint. The Israeli side denied such a promise and held the ceasefire to be unconditional, but has removed some restrictions on Al-Aqsa and credit can be given to Hamas for it. Sheikh Jarrah is a more complicated issue, but there is still no agreement on both sides. The Supreme Court of Israel is yet to give a final ruling on the eviction of Palestinians. If Israel goes heads-on with the eviction process, there can be more protests and violence. Israel says there cannot be lasting peace as long as Hamas launches rockets, whereas Hamas says there will be rockets till the occupation concludes. This is the conclusive statement made by author in this article. The next article that I would be discussing is Gaza at breaking point may curb Israel's economic recovery. The cost of the 11-day hostilities, published in the editorial of the Indian Express on May 21st. This article discusses about the loss which has been caused due to the 11-day conflict regarding the Al-Aqsa Mosque to both sides. Israeli manufacturers have stated that the loss cost to the economy between May 11 to May 13 has reached $166 million. The 11-day conflict between Israel and Palestinians disabled Gaza's sanitation facilities and infrastructure and also reduced the basic supplies in Gaza. Let us first try to understand the loss caused to Gaza. According to the Gaza Ministry, 16,800 housing units have been damaged, 1,800 have been declared unfit for living, and 1,000 were destroyed. Residents of Gaza were only getting 3 to 4 hours power supply now in comparison to 12 hours earlier. The Hamas media has reported that the bombardments have caused 40 million damage to factories and have stripped the industrial zone. $22 million damage has been caused to the energy sector. $27 million damage has been caused to the Gaza's agricultural industry. According to a UN statement, Palestinians have no or limited access to water after the conflict. The UN Refugee Agency for Palestinians, UNRWA, has launched an appeal for an additional $38 million funding to cover urgent humanitarian needs in Gaza and Israel-occupied West Bank. Now let us go on to the Israeli side and see what losses have hit Israel. The economy contracted by 6.5% in the first quarter on the face of the corona pandemic already in Israel. The economists of the Central Bureau of Statistics had warned that if a conflict occurs between the both sides, then it will be very, very difficult to curb the recovery from the healthcare crisis. On On May 13th, Israeli manufacturers stated that the loss to the economy was approximately 540 million between May 11 to May 13. There is also a delay of fuel supply as trade and shipping industries have diverted to other Israeli ports. There is no up-to-date information regarding the full economic damage caused by the shelling on both sides. But this gives us an understanding of how much losses can occur if war takes place. In the last article that I would be discussing would give an insight of India's stand on the Israel-Palestine conflict. The article I would be discussing is in how has India's policy on Israel-Palestine evolved, written by Nirupama Subramaniam, published in the May 25th Indian Express Explained section. She begins the article by stating that the T.S. Tirumurthy, a permanent representative to UN, made a statement in the UN Security Council open debate regarding the Israel-Palestine violence and pressed for the maintenance of balance of India's relations with Israel as well as Palestine. The statements made on behalf of India held Israel responsible for causing violence in East Jerusalem. The message to Israel from India is not to change its status quo in East Jerusalem and neighboring places. This also applies to the Palestinian side. India has taken a balanced stand, which can be seen in the further discussion of the article. India's policy is twofold. In the first to 4 decades, India was unequivocally pro-Palestine, but in the latter 3 decades, it started establishing friendly ties with Israel. In the recent years, India's position can be perceived as pro-Israel. Let us understand this through a timeline. In 1948, India was the only non-Arab country among the 13 countries that voted against the UN partition plan in the General Assembly that led to the creation of Israel. Scholars ascribe various reasons for India doing so because of India's own partition taking place along religious lines, to show solidarity with dispossessed Palestinian people and to ward off Pakistan's plan to isolate India over Kashmir. India's energy dependence on Arab countries can also be cited as a reason, as well as respecting the sentiments of Indian Muslims. In 1953, the consulate in Mumbai started giving visas to Indian Jewish community as well as Christian pilgrims as a mark of establishing bilateral relations. However, in 1982, the consulate was to shut down because the Consul General criticized India's foreign policy in a newspaper interview. In 1992, this started to change and India balanced its ties by normalizing relations with Israel. In the context of the Soviet Union breakup, an immense shift in geopolitics of West Asia based on the first Gulf War in 1990. Later, in Jan 1992, India opened an Indian embassy in Tel Aviv, marking an end to the cold shoulder treatment being meted by India to Israel. Even PM Jawaharlal Nehru decided to give recognition to Israel, as not doing so would create rancor between 2 UN members. After 2.5 decades from 2014, India and Israel relationship began to grow in the fields of defense, agriculture, science and technology, where deals were established. Few high-profile visits were made by BJP-led NDA-1 leaders, such as Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, to Israel, because BJP's Hindutva ideal demands for a strong state that firmly deals with terrorists, and Israel is an example. In 1970, BJP forerunner Jana Singh also made ties with Israel. In 2000, L.K. Advani visited Israel to set up an anti-terror commission. In 2003, Ariel Sharon became the first Israeli Prime Minister to visit India. In the newly formed NDA-2 government under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he decided to go for a full-fledged relationship with Israel. The first indication was abstention of India at the Human Rights Council recently on a welcoming a report by the Human Rights Commission High Commissioner regarding which produced evidence of alleged war crimes committed by Israeli forces and Hamas in the 2014 airstrikes, killing over 2,000 people in Gaza. India's abstention is conspicuous as it supported in 2014 of setting up of a UNHRC inquiry against Israel. In 2016, India again abstained from voting on the UNHRC resolution against Israel. In 2017, Mahmoud Abbas, the PLO chief, visited New Delhi for establishing ties with India. Earlier, when a two-state solution was proposed for solving the Israel-Palestine conflict, India supported of East Jerusalem as a capital of Palestinian state. However, in 2021, reference to East Jerusalem as capital of Palestine was missing during Abbas's visit in the Modi speech. In 2015, Minister Pranab Mukherjee decided to visit Israel by stopping at Ramallah. He also reiterated India's position on the city as a capital of independent Palestine. However, in February 2018, PM Modi became the first Prime Minister to visit Israel, but his itinerary did not include Ramallah. India's status has become clear that it's a de-hyphenation of Israel-Palestine relationship, where it would deal with Israel and Palestine separately. India has taken a balancing stand, where de-hyphenation is a careful balancing where India shifts from one side to another as the situation demands. Even when it's abstained at UNESCO on December 2017, India has still voted in favor of a resolution in General Assembly opposing the Trump administration's recognition of Jerusalem as the Israeli capital. In the UNHRC's 46th session in Geneva, India has voted against Israel in 3 resolutions: the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people, Israel's settlement policy, and the human rights situation in Golan Heights. But it abstained on the 4th issue, being the UNHRC report on human rights situation in Palestine, including East Jerusalem. In February, the International Criminal Court claimed jurisdiction to investigate into the human rights abuses taking place in the Palestinian territories, including West Bank and Gaza, and named Israeli security forces. Prime Minister Netanyahu wanted India to take a stand on the issue, as India did not recognize the International Criminal Court rulings, but India did not come forward. India is though not pro-Palestine, it's hardly taken a stand on Israel, or it's not supported Israel. The author concludes by stating that Netanyahu thanked all countries that stood resolutely by Israel and its right to self-defense against terrorist attacks by posting all their flags, but the tricolor was missing.